Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Students of the Word. This is session number 5, and today we are hoping to finish. We're going to talk about verse 4. We're going to hope to finish the first paragraph of 1 John chapter 1. Very exciting. Let me start off with a little bit of recap, because it's always really important. It's one of the dangers, obviously, of studying as slowly as we're doing, and I don't apologize for the slowness. This is exactly what I had planned to do. But one thing we have to be very careful of course, is that we don't lose sight of the big picture, right? I mean, when you're, people talk about, missing the forest for the trees. You can stop and look at, study the leaves so carefully that you forget you're even in a forest, right? And obviously we don't want to do that. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of kind of recap at the beginning of every episode, I think, pretty much, because I want to make sure as we approach, the next verse or whatever, we're probably going to average about a verse a week. I think that it's pretty much my goal. It feels like that's working out pretty well so far. So I think that's about the pace we're going to go, but we have to make sure that we are connecting it. And obviously during the course of our discussion, we're going to be doing a lot of interconnection. That is one of the things that John's kind of all about. I mean, his patterns of repeated language make it almost impossible not to make connections back and forth when we're paying close attention. But nevertheless, I don't want to lose sight of the momentum of what we've been talking about. And I'm also hoping to, when we finish talking about verse 4, he says with confidence, that when we get to that point, I want to kind of pause and look back a little bit more over the whole paragraph and what that, shows us and what we learn from that. So let me start with my little recap. So last week, of course, we got to the main verb, right? Verse 3, where we finally was revealed the main subject and verb of the sentence, and it was kind of a bombshell, right? We got to that main verb, which was proclaim, right? We proclaim to you. But then he didn't proclaim. It sounded like he was setting up a proclamation that he was making, and then he takes a pivot, right? Instead of proclaiming a thing, he instead says, these things that we have seen and heard proclaim we unto you, so that, right? And then he gives the reason why he's proclaiming instead of actually making his proclamation. And that reason, of course, was that you, plural, may have fellowship with us, right? And that I was talking about seemed rather a surprise, right? At least I was a little surprised at the proclamation. Instead of proclaiming about God or about Jesus or the incarnation or whatever else, right? Instead, he says the purpose, the reason for doing this. We're proclaiming this so that, not so that you may have fellowship with God, but so that you may have fellowship with us. And he tacks on, because our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, right? That thing which sounds like a proclamation, but instead gets added on as like a sort of rider, right? And of course, I'm not at all meaning to say that the fellowship with the Father and Son is secondary. In a sense, of course, it plainly comes first. He even seems to be assuming it, right? Granted that we are in granted that we are in fellowship with the Father and the Son, right? I mean, so like that seems to be primary, objectively speaking, right? But it is not primary in his emphasis, right? It is not what he comes in emphasizing. What he comes in emphasizing is not the fellowship with the Father and the Son, but the fellowship with, his fellowship with their fellowship with him. That is that kind of horizontal fellowship among believers. That's his primary focus, the primary focus of the sentence, right? Rather than the fellowship with Jesus. So whatever this is, however that works, the fellowship with one another, it's the same thing, right? He repeats the same word. The relationship that we have with each other and the relationship that we have with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, right? That word koinonia, that fellowship, that communion that we have with each other it's the same. He uses the same word, right? That's like same, again, he's repeating the same word, just a couple words separated from each other. It's extremely emphatic in that way, right? And I think we should, let's think about that for a second, right? I mean, they're about the similarity of those, the kind of reciprocity, in a sense, of those relationships, right? It's not like, I mean, I was just trying to think of like, metaphors. How can I get this, right? How can I really understand what this means? And of course, like the very first thing I thought of was like, well, it's like marriage, right? You get married to a spouse, and then you are sort of, grafted into that spouse's family, right? But it's actually very different from that, right? And I think too different from that in two ways, right? First of all, because as much as you might be sort of theoretically grafted in, I don't know, it's my own experience has never really been that I've been, my relationship with my mother-in-law is just not the same as my relationship with my mother, nor hers with me, as hers with her other siblings. There's still an in-law thing. It's still kind of a legality, and it's not the same. Patrick says my in-laws are very much acquaintances. Yeah. But here's another thing. There's yet another way in which, so it's not just that the metaphor kind of works but doesn't quite get there, because that often happens with analogies, right? You make an analogy and it's kind of like the thing, but it's not the full thing, right? But it's not even that. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this failed in an even more profound way, because the point is not exactly that we establish one relationship with God, and then that establishes a different relationship with, other, like the other people who have a relationship with God, right? Like my in-laws, right? Because howsoever close my relationship with my mother-in-law were, it would not be the same relationship as my relationship with my wife, right? I mean, that I think is amply clear. But that nevertheless is exactly, I mean, he uses the same word, right? There's a much greater mutuality. I mean, the kind of fellowship, the kind of connection, the kind of, oneness among believers. He's using the same word to describe that as he uses to describe that relationship between us and God, right? And so that I find myself falling back, as is probably more advisable in the first place, not on my own enormously clumsy, and in fact it turns out wholly inapt analogy, but on Paul's image of the body, right? That seems much more clearly to capture the kind of thing that John seems to be pointing to here in verse 3, where all are joined together in one body, in one organism, right? If Jesus is the head of the body, as Paul says, and we are all different members, different organs, different parts of that body, we are all related to each other and to the head in a sense, in the same way. Now, the head's relationship to us is different, right? But in one sense, we are all related to, in the sense that we're all part of one organism, right? We are all joined together in one body and related to each other in the same kind of mutual way, right? So that seems to me to be what is suggested. What is and I think it's really important that we wrestle. That's why I wanted to come back to this at the beginning today, because I think it's really important that we wrestle with this. I think this is one of those things, and there are going to be a whole lot of them in 1 John. Things that John says, things that we may believe, like is probably a part of like a doctrinal statement to which we which we affirm, but which I think is often not an actual reality in our lives, right? Do we have that? Do we see ourselves, right, joined to each other as essentially as we are joined to God? Do we see that reciprocity, right? Koinonia, right? We have a fellowship with one another, and our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. And what does that mean? We'll think a little bit more about that, I hope, before the end. One possible additional reading of this, let me pull up this, I gotta have the verse in front of me here. One possible reading of this that I didn't think of last week occurred to me when I was doing my recap. Always a risk of thinking about a recap. Is that one possible implication of how he constructs the sentence there in verse 3 is that he sort of is seeing himself as a kind of intermediary, right? What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. That is, one could possibly see this sentence as him as a kind of an intermediary term, right? I want you to have fellowship with me, and this brings us back to the us pronoun, right? And we'll come back to that later on today. But let me, for now, knowing that I'm changing it, change it to me just because it'll make the emphasis a little bit clearer of what I'm suggesting right here. That you may have fellowship with me, because and truly my fellowship is with the Father and the Son. Ergo, right? Since if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C, voila, right? I mean, that's one, I could imagine that is a possible reading of this. Now, I don't think that he's sort of elevating himself. That I don't think doesn't seem to fit with what he's talking about here. Because I mean, it also sort of works. That's the thing about those, the sort of the transitive property business, right? Is that it works. There's the commutative property, isn't it? That says if A is equal to B, then B is equal to A, right? In other words, that it goes back the other direction as well. Yeah. So I don't. In one sense, I think that the intermediary thing. I think that there's a reality there. John is aware of the fact that he is the transmitter of the message, right? And even if we go back to verse 1, he's the one who touched the word with his hands. They presumably haven't. Most of them, I don't know for sure who they are, or if they ever had the chance to, drop by Judea when Jesus was around, or what. But presumably there are at least some people that he's talking to who have not, in fact, handled with their hands the word of life, right? Even if they have handled with their hands the word of life stuff. But so there is a sense in which the apostle, as an apostle, right, is an intermediary, right? I have heard, I have seen, I have handled, and I proclaim and testify, right? These things to you, and so that there is that kind of an intermediary sense. But I don't think, in the end, I don't think that this and one of the things that makes me come back to this as I was thinking about verse 4, we're going to get one of John's favorite verbs. It's gonna be one of the most often repeated verbs in the entire epistle, but I'm not planning to put it on the word list. It's interesting, but it's not exactly word list stuff, and that is right, grapho. That is to say, John is drawing attention to his authorship, to his activity in writing this epistle. He does it all the time. He does it very frequently throughout the epistle. And so again, there's that sort of posture of him as he knows he is the writer, he is the messenger right here, he is the one proclaiming, and we'll look at several points. This is going to be a thing. His relationship with them, and what he suggests about his relationship with his readers, is definitely going to be a thing we're going to come back to many times throughout our discussions of the epistles, and I think that that's going to be very interesting. But and so that's why I bring up this intermediary thing, is that there is a way, I think it does fit sort of part of the frame. But in conclusion here, fellowship with God, which does seem to come first, that is, he seems to presume on the fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Indeed, our fellowship is with the Father. Fellowship with God brings us into fellowship with each other. Fellowship with each other brings us into fellowship with God as well. And it's not at all clear that we can have one without the other. Hillary asks a great question. Did we discuss the two? No, so that you too may have fellowship with us. Yeah, let's look at that. Where are we here? Verse 4. Okay. I think that's just the also here. So that also, the kai. Yes. That which we have seen and heard. Right. We proclaim kai to you, so that kai you. So we've got the also. We proclaim also, so that you also may have fellowship with us, seems to be. Now, I don't know exactly how the kai idiom works there, like the repetition of the kai, the also, and also. I mean, kai is and, right? And also, apparently. So that's being rendered here. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. So that also you may have fellowship with us. Is the also kind of attached to the you, or is it attached to the have? Right, so that you too can have fellowship with that. You can have fellowship too, or you are also having. Right. Okay. So the kai humes is you too, basically. Okay. So it is kind of attached to the pronoun there. Yeah, how conjunctions function in Greek is something I don't understand at all. So happy to rely upon those who know more than I about that. Okay, so that you too may have fellowship with us. Yeah. And that's interesting, Hillary. One of the things that suggests to me, you too. Well, you too may have fellowship with us. Suggests you're joining others who are having, like, there's already people who have fellowship with them, right? And who is it? Oh, turns out it's the Father and the Son, right? It's like, join us. I'm over here with the Father and the Son, right? Welcome. I think that's I think that's interesting. It could, he could also be referring to, the rest of the fellowship of believers. Yeah, that, like, presumably there are others who have heard the message prior, to when they did or whatever. But again, the thing that I would emphasize, it seems clear he's not proclaiming the message as to people who don't know it. And he's going to make that very explicit later on in the epistle. He's not welcoming in, inviting in potential new believers here. That's not his point. That's very clear. Yeah. Yeah. So that you too may have fellowship with us. That's why we proclaim it. Yeah. Sorry, what I'm pausing over there for a second is just trying to understand. He's not just saying, I'm doing this and this outcome is going to happen from it. The outcome being that you too are going to have fellowship with us. But he's explaining, this is the purposes. This is why I'm doing this in the first place, right? This is the whole reason for proclaiming. In other words, I'm seeing this sentence from both perspectives, right? Like, for your from where you're standing, what's the reason for this? That you may have fellowship with us, right? From where I'm standing, right? What is the purpose of this? Why am I proclaiming in the first place? Because he's caring about them. Yeah, the hina. In order that the hina, we're going to come back to the hina, because in fact we're gonna start with that, because we get that very quickly again in verse 4, right? These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. And scanning over the Greek here for a moment, and these things we write, graphomen, so that hina again. And that's the same conjunction. Hina, the joy of us may be full. And then if we go back, it was the same, just confirming, there it is, hina. So that you also, in that same exact phrase we were just looking at, so that you too may have fellowship with us, right? So he uses the exact same conjunction, exact same construction in both of those two verses, right? We proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. See the pattern there? See the repetition there? Anybody else getting a Hebrew poetry vibe here in verse 3 and 4? Is this making anybody else feel kind of psalmish? Because it totally is me, right? This is... oh, goodness. I was about to give a massively oversimplified version of Hebrew poetics forms, but I know so little about it that I feel I'm going to embarrass myself. But all I'll say about it, because I am such a noob in studying Hebrew poetry that I don't feel like I can teach about it. But what we see in Hebrew poetry is the essential, the functional element of Hebrew poetry, like what makes it tick, is the pattern of repeated structures, and those repeated structures are used in different ways. Right. So, I mean, like, just to give a quick example, the first one I could think of from one of my favorite Psalms, which is Psalms 1. Right. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. Right. The parallel construction of the two things, which are juxtaposed with each other. Right. And sometimes they're juxtaposed. It's like the same thing, more or less the same sentiment being stated, but being stated in different terms. Sometimes the thing is reversed. Sometimes it's said in the same terms, but said the opposite, like it's sort of flipped. Like, so we see this good thing, so we don't see the opposite bad thing. You see what I mean? Anyway, so the repetition functions in lots of different ways, but that basic impulse of sort of stating and then restating, and sometimes doing a third thing afterwards, is that's the heart. It's the heart of Hebrew poetics. It is kind of what makes Hebrew poetry tick, as I understand. And certainly we see it all over the place, and not only in poetry. Like, it's like, for those who grew up memorizing Psalms, it's like how you think. Right. And we can see Jesus thinks that way too. There are a bunch of times when you can see Jesus using similar kind of constructions in his prose, right? In his prose teachings, which are also often a little bit poetic. But do you see what I mean here? Let me reread 3 and 4, but I'm going to skip the writer, the very important writer. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Listen to how the structure is without that. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. These things we write, so that our joy may be complete. See what I mean? The two verses seem to me really importantly parallel. And I kind of came to this by when I was just like, well, okay, he just said we proclaim to you, and then he said these things we write, right? So like the writing and the proclaiming seem to be obviously parallel, right? So that's where I kind of started. Then I'm like, wait a second, hang on now. Yeah. So Stephen, in a sense, the repetition in Hebrew poetry is kind of like rhyming in European poetry and alliteration in Anglo-Saxon poetry. Yeah, kind of. It's complicated because, of course, those are different. What's the repetition thing? It's not exactly a metrical tool. It kind of is too, but it's more conceptual. It's more conceptual. It's the other two are like rhyme and alliteration in alliterative poetry are sort of mechanical tools, right? How you shape the sounds of the poetry. And it's not exactly the same. The repetition isn't exactly the same. Yeah, Randall says it's like rhyming ideas rather than sounds. That's a good way to think. I mean, not that they're all always rhyming in exactly the same way, but yeah, I mean, that's exactly that. That gap is exactly what I'm trying to point to here. The gap between the poetic stuff that's about sound and the repetition, which is really about how the ideas flow. There are, I believe, now again, I don't know Hebrew. My Hebrew is like way worse even than my Greek. But when I have heard Psalms read aloud in Hebrew, I feel like you can hear there is an oral component to those repetitions as well. It does provide a kind of metrical structure, but it's not like rhyme and alliteration in the sense that like it's kind of maintained. It gives a structure to the entire poem. The entire poem isn't built of those repetitions. They come up with some frequency and in some patterns, I believe. But it's not like, again, like, you're reading a line of poetry or like lines of, because you can hear the rhyme and you can feel the meter, right? Or you can hear the alliteration. Like that's how you're reading poetry, right? Nu we schulen herjeon heofen reaches weart mehr todes meacht and his mod you thunk, right? You get the H's and you get the M's and you're like, okay, poetry, got it, tracking, right? But stretches of the Psalms will go by without repetitions, right? So it's not exactly the same in that way. But anyway, so it's, like I say, here's me trying to answer questions about something I know very little about. But anyway, it is. So I say it's more about the ideas than it is about the sound. Okay, I think. But let's think about the other half of that, right? If the proclaiming and the writing are parallel here, right? We proclaim to you that you may have fellowship with us. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete, right? The parallel is with the joy being made complete. Now I want to come back to the significance of that parallel because I think that's amazing in lots of ways. But first, let's focus on our joy being made complete. There are two concepts here, and I think that it's very important that we notice both of them. There's several things to notice that I think are easy to overlook. One, having joy, right? Chara, right? Chara is the word, right? There it is, chara, joy. That your joy may be complete, like filled up, right? Isn't that what the pleromene means? Mene, like filled up, right? Is my understanding of that word. But anyway, so that our joy may be made complete. Notice the joy is presupposed, right? Like they have joy. They have joy. This is not the introduction of joy, right? It doesn't say these things I write so that like you may experience joy. This is not I've got great news for you. There's joy now, right? Before there was not joy, but now there is not what he's saying. He presupposes joy. Your joy, our joy. We'll get to that in a minute. The joy, right? The joy may be made complete. And of course, it would make sense that they already have the joy if they already have koinonia with the Father and the Son, as seems to be implied at the end of verse 3, right? The emphasis that he makes is on completeness, right? On the completeness, that your joy should be filled up. Notice one of the implications of this then, by the way. It is very possible to have incomplete, unfull joy. You may know God. You may, in a sense, have fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, and yet have joy which is not made complete. You have joy. You can't, I think, have that, right? Have koinonia with the Father and the Son without joy at all, right? But apparently it is possible for your joy not to be made, for you to have incomplete joy, right? And that I think that's important. And how do we make that joy complete? This is where I go back to the parallelism, right? We proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us. We write so that our joy may be made complete. And that's amazing to me. That's amazing to me. This is where the completeness of joy comes from. From, the Word of Life stuff. Not just from the Word of Life. Not just from the Word of Life. Listen to that. But you see what I mean, right? It's, again, that is, do you believe in the incarnation? Jesus was incarnated, right? The Word came. The life came. The Word of Life came, right? Yeah. But is your joy complete? What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen, looked at, handled concerning the Word of Life, about the Word of Life, that Word of Life stuff. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us, so that our joy may be made complete. The completeness, we talked last time about, so the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. What now? Right? What now? What happens next? Right? What does that mean for us? How does that change reality from now on? And this is one of the things that I love about this epistle so much, is that it's one of the things that I in my life I think I've often struggled with. The gap, right? That is like, I'm cool with the gospel. I'm cool with the New Jerusalem, right? But there's this, what happens now? That's where we live. Where we live is in between the two. The gospel has come. The fullness of the kingdom has not yet come, right? What now? Where do we live? What do we do? What does it mean now? We're neither in the one state, we're in this liminal state, right? We're in this boundary zone in between the two. That is in between the time before the gospel, right? The time before the incarnation. Jesus' coming mattered. It changed things, right? The work has been done. It's happened. And yet the work isn't over. It's still happening. It's going to be consummated, right? The marriage with the Lamb will be consummated. But what now, right? What happens now? That's, as I say, that's been something I've often struggled with over the course of my life. I am really grateful for the fact that John seems to be addressing almost entirely that, right? And again, this is just, it's one of the things that I think, I've talked before about how, for me, my heart is sort of less in the spreading of the gospel in the sense of informing people who don't know, who have not heard about Jesus, and more in the, we have the gospel, now what, right? Because again, that's where all of us live, right? And where that's, again, what I was moved to kind of, that's, the folks I was moved to address. It was the what now that I definitely have felt myself moved to address. And as I say, really looking forward to seeing more about what John has to tell us about this. That's really interesting. Patrick is saying that according to the Perseus database, which lists, Patrick, if I'm understanding Perseus correctly, the Perseus database lists the usage of Greek words like in, recorded texts. And he says that according to the Perseus database, the word charis, the joy word, is used far more in the New Testament than anywhere else. It's used twice as much in the New Testament as anywhere else in recorded Greek literature. They're much more focused on joy. Though, by the way, Patrick, it's not all that many, is it? How many entries do you have in the New Testament? I mean, it comes up a tolerable amount, but it's not like agape or something, right? Like 59 total. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. But it's. I found when looking it up, it came up less often than I expected. Almost. It's a really important note. 59 is a lot, though. But of course, the New Testament is also a lot. It's pretty big. So if you think about that, like. Average number of references to joy per book in the New Testament. That's the number that was like sort of fewer than I felt, in a sense, if you see what I mean. Okay. Anyway, back to the parallelism then for a second. The parallelism suggests a connection, not necessarily a causal connection, between our fellowship with each other and our joy being made complete. Now, I want to resist just linking those causally. I'm not saying there isn't a causal link, but I'm not saying that the parallel mandates that. I don't think we can look at the parallel and say, therefore, he's saying our joy won't be made complete unless we have fellowship with each other. Or the purpose of our having fellowship with each other is that it should then make our joy be full. The two of them are parallel with each other. I would say the same thing in a sense about both. I was saying that his reference to our joy being made complete proves that it's possible to have incomplete joy. You can have joy, but a joy which is not complete. So too, I think it is possible not to have fellowship with one another. Else, why would he be making that a priority? Right? So that you too may have fellowship with us. I'm doing it so that you may have fellowship with us. In other words, you don't necessarily already, or you might not automatically, right? There's a difference. I talked about the body of Christ, and there's a sense in which that's simply a reality, right? We are connected with each other. Paul's language there seems pretty clear about that, that we are a part of the same body with each other. You don't get a vote, right? You don't get to vote who's in and who's out. You don't get to choose whether or not you're going to join. Like if you are in fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, you are in fellowship with the rest of the body as well. That is not, I don't believe that is escapable. However, there seems to be something, just as you can have incomplete joy, I think you can have incomplete fellowship too. Just because you might, in fact, have this kind of relation, this body relationship, right? Body part relationship, this organism relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that you're walking in that. And that's going to be one of the things that I'm emphasizing this. I think it's explicit in verse 4, and it's only the reference to completeness, right? Which of course points out the incompleteness. It was only that made me start thinking in these terms about verse 3. And when I started doing that, I sort of realized, yeah, actually, this is what he's going to be talking about this throughout the epistle. It's no new message he's going to be giving them, but there are going to be lots of places where he's saying, let's make this complete. Let's actually think this through. I want you to realize what all of this means so that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Let's get to the... now, Heya? I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Heya. Knowing the gospel brings joy. Yes, I think so. They have received the gospel message, and so they have joy. But he's writing to them so that their joy, our joy, your joy, our joy, may be made complete. So yes, it does seem there are a lot of things so I'm being cautious here in how I say these things. And soon I'm going to stop talking about this because I'm peeking ahead and it's not fair. We're not there yet. We'll see it as we go on. But there are lots of places where John is going to say some very black and white things, right? He'll say a lot of all or nothing stuff in this epistle. It's the all or nothing stuff, I think, that makes people really uncomfortable with 1 John very often, right? I was going to say lots of all or nothing stuff, lots of kind of he's going to establish lots of dichotomies, right? Lots of binaries, either this or that. But at the same time, and so that would make you think, if you're thinking in those terms, like, okay, so if you have the gospel, you have joy. You either have joy or you don't have joy, right? But we can see here, no, you can have joy, but that joy not be full, right? So at the same time that John is going to be talking about some pretty black and white binaries, light and darkness, that kind of thing, his premise as he's beginning here is that it's not automatic necessarily, right? That is, just because you believe the good news, right? Just because you believe in the word of life doesn't necessarily mean that your joy may be made complete. That's why he's writing, so that their joy may be made complete. It doesn't happen automatically necessarily. Yes, Stephen, I do think that. We should keep in mind that he's not necessarily talking about salvation, but about completeness of joy and fellowship. Yes, I think that I think it's pretty clear, and I think he will make it explicit later on in the epistle, that he is assuming that the people he's writing to are saved. Right. It's not a question. He's not talking to unbelievers at any point. He's not addressing unbelievers at any point in this letter. And I don't think that any of what he's saying is intended to convince anybody to become a believer who is not a believer. I'm not saying that it mightn't have that, like that, someone who doesn't believe mightn't, read this epistle and become a believer. I'm not, who knows? But what I'm saying is I don't think that that's his intended audience. So yes, I think that And again, this is again what I feel, because to make it even more personal, I was talking about that gap, right? The gap between the incarnation and the New Jerusalem. This what now that we live in, have been living in for 2,000 years, right? But to speak also more personally about my own life, right? Within each one of our own lives, we also have a parallel moment, right? Between when we become believers, right? Between baptism, right? Between when we accept and between when we are glorified, right? Someday I will know even as I am known, right? And someday I will know even as I am known, and at one point I didn't believe. But in between, there's this, now what? I'm a believer now, right? I believe in the gospel. I have the promises of God. And yet I've got a lot of life to live, right? I mean, the decades of my life, for me, it's been decades, right, that have stretched between when I believed and to when I shall know even as I am known, are long, just as those, millennia of the world have been long, right? I have, as I said in the very first session, this is why I'm doing this, because I have felt in my own life, I have experienced so little teaching that has really been targeted there. I've spent most of my adult Christian life listening to sermons that were designed to convince people to become believers, because that was the understanding of the Great Commission. I don't believe that's what the Great Commission says. That's part of it. It's an important part of it, but it's not the only part of it. Anyway, the point is, John is addressing that. So I do think that it's important for us to recall, when he's talking about stuff that needs to happen, like your joy being made complete, he's not talking about like, if you only accept Jesus and accept him as your king, then your joy will be made complete. No. You have. That's why you have joy, because you have accepted Jesus. But your joy it's not yet complete, right? And that's where John had my attention. I was like, no, please tell me more. This is what I want to know. This is what I want to know. Yeah. Oh man, Hillary, you're right. Hillary's talked about spending a lot of time angsting over some of the dichotomies and black and white statements in First John. Oh man, like I'm telling you, I'm convinced this is why like there are so few Bible studies on the Epistle of First John. In let's just say my college Christian fellowship never chose First John as an epistle to study. It makes people pretty uncomfortable. Anyway, so this is what we're doing here together, and this is, I believe, what John is talking about. So it is important. Like, we get so used to thinking in those terms. So much Christian teaching, modern Christian teaching at least, is focused on that moment of conversion, that we're kind of used to using that almost as a kind of like frame or filter, right, for any kind of Bible teaching. Right. When we're talking, when we hear, a Bible author talking about a change, right, advocating a change, like this will happen to you, we tend automatically to attach it to the conversion moment, because that's what we spend almost all of our time thinking about. Right. But it's going to be important, Stephen, I think, at many points to keep in mind. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about the making complete that happens afterwards. And I think that that's pretty exciting. And Tim, I totally agree with you. Believing is a process, not a moment. That's absolutely true. Yeah. It is a becoming. Absolutely. Okay. I want to talk about pronouns because since last week, I've been promising to come back and talk about the pronouns. And many of you will know why I've been saving this for verse 4, because check this out. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. We got two pronouns here. The verb, right? We write, which is first person plural verb, and our joy. So we get one proper pronoun and one verb conjugation, right? The verb conjugation, we write, is first person plural. And then one legit pronoun itself, our joy, right? The joy of us might be complete. But not all of your translations might have that, right? Most of the modern ones do. But we go, hang on, I prepared verse 5 just in case we get there. But if you look at the King James, for instance, and these things write we unto you that your joy may be full. There is an actual differences in manuscripts here. Some manuscripts have you, the joy of you. Some of them have the joy of us. There is a textual variant here, and my understanding from people who know far more about this than I is that it's scholars, biblical scholars have generally accepted the fact that our is the correct reading, right? That it's hard whenever you come across this, and whenever you come across manuscript variants. There's a whole bunch of ways in which manuscript variants can sometimes happen, and you have to draw conclusions based. It's not just a question of like which one is older necessarily. Sometimes that can help, but there are lots of complicated ways in which you can try to figure out what is the best evidence to suggest what the proper or original reading of the manuscript should be. But the commonly accepted modern reading is our. What I'm really interested in is the variant here, because I think that the error is really fun here. Here's why I think the variant is fun. I think it's fun because this is only one way, but one way in which errors like this get into manuscripts is you have to remember that manuscripts have to be written by hand, hence the name, right? So when you're copying manuscripts, like you've got a person, right, who's copying, and they sometimes make mistakes, right? Now, sometimes they make random mistakes, but actually, usually they're pretty careful, right? And usually their mistakes are not random. That is, sometimes they'll do a word that's very similar, right? I mean, I don't just like say like there's one word, like they don't like one manuscript says lion, right? And so they're copying their manuscript and they say like goatee instead. Like you don't just put something random down, right? You might put another word that is very like it, right? Maybe you changed it in your head, right? Or a word that sounds like it, or a word that's almost that that's shaped like it, or whatever. Sometimes, and as Timothy is pointing out, the words are very similar. The of us and of you words are very similar in Greek. So that's a place where it often comes. Sometimes a variant creeps in when you have an activist scribe. Because remember, the scribe knows that the thing that he's copying, like the physical piece of paper over here, or papyrus or whatever it is, right? The document over here that he's copying was itself copied by somebody else who was doing his job before, right? And so sometimes if you've got scribes whose job is to produce, like mass produce. I mean, if you're part of like a sort of a printing press, right? You know, a pre-printing press, printing press, where you've got a bunch of people producing copies, you know, so that you can produce a bunch of copies so they can be distributed to multiple people, or multiple places. You might be, who knows, you might be copying the work of, you know, somebody else. Anyway, whatever. You know that somebody else wrote this, right? So sometimes you have an activist scribe who says, I think that must be a mistake. I think that must be a mistake. And because they know how, I mean, nobody knows better than the scribe how scribal errors can sometimes happen, right? So they'll be like, oh, they must have meant this. Right? And so sometimes you can see that there are, this sometimes happens. There's evidence of this kind of thing in medieval manuscript history for sure. Anyway, here's what I like about this variant. It's very close. Of you, of us, right? Very, very small. It's like one letter difference, right? So, that's what Tim's telling me here. You have a scribe who says, wait a second, look at the shape of this, right? We have seen and heard, we proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us, and our fellowship is with the Father. These things we write so that your joy may be made complete. That makes more sense, doesn't it? Right? I mean, we proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us. We write so that your joy may be made complete. Right? Clearly. I mean, that seems the sense of it, doesn't it? It seems to fit the pattern of what we see in you know, with verse 3 and 4, especially if you're, you know, catching the parallelism between verse 3 and 4, right? You might be like, yeah, you, clearly you, right? So even if the manuscript you're copying, it's possible you could just make a slip, right? You just, you know, write your instead of our, one letter difference, right? You just make a mistake. It's possible. It's also possible it's not a mistake. It's possible you're like, no, wait, hang on, that doesn't make sense. These things we write that our joy may be made complete. What, your own joy? Well, no, hang on. Like, it's not like it's not about self-gratification. You're proclaiming to us so that you may have fellowship with us. We write so that your joy may be made complete. That makes more sense. And it kind of like does, in a sense, make more sense, right? It follows the pattern of verse 3 and 4. But I love the hour. I am cheerful to, I'm delighted in this. I'm delighted to agree with I'm delighted that modern scholarship agrees with the reading I really like, because I think that the hour there is a beautiful thing. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. What is the parallelism? Our joy may be made complete is paralleled with you having fellowship with us, right? We have the you and us in verse 3. We don't have the you and us. I think we don't have the you and us on purpose in verse 4, right? You and us, and then our in verse 4. Because remember, that's what the whole point of verse 3 is, that the you and the us shall have fellowship together, shall be joined, right? That you and we shall become an us, right? That's the purpose of the proclamation. And then in verse 4, he says, we write these things so that our joy. And that, I've been, you know, I've been talking about the inclusive or exclusive we, especially back in verse 1, we were talking about this, remember? And it doesn't sound like an inclusive we, that he's including his readers. I mean, in the we, at the beginning there, especially when we get into, by the time we get into verse 3, and we've got, we have seen, we proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us. That seems clearly exclusive, right? There's the we over here and there's the you over there. I said that I felt that he was being inclusive with the we all, that there's at least like an overlay in which he's being implicitly inclusive in the we from the beginning. Even though I acknowledge there's another way in which it doesn't make sense. I think there's a tension there. But verse 4 now, these things we write so that our joy may be made complete. I'm ready to fight with anybody. Well, I wouldn't fight because we have fellowship one with another. But I'm ready to maintain, to fight in fellowship over the inclusiveness of the hour there. Of that, I think that's extremely important. In fact, if the hour is the correct reading, I'm inclined to say something as extreme as the inclusiveness of that hour in the 4th verse is like the culmination of the whole paragraph. Our joy may be complete. This is why is he writing? So that our joy, the ourness, right? The togetherness, the koinonia, like that all of the koinonia is all rolled up together. The koinonia of us with each other is rolled up in the our joy, and the completion of our joy is the completion of the koinonia among us, between us and God. And Alex is just asking, is the completeness bound up in including the audience in the joy? Yeah, I really think it is. I don't think the sentence actually works if he said, like, these things we write so that my joy may be made complete. Frankly, I'm just doing this because that's what makes me happy, right? No, that wouldn't work, right? Nor do I think it is simply for your sake, right? So that you guys over there may have joy. Alex says perhaps incomplete joy is joy that I have and you don't, in a sense. Yeah. But Alex, I don't even think that, because I think that his joy would be incomplete unless their joy is complete too, right? I mean, it's part of the filling up, part of the completion, right? It isn't just that his joy is only made perfect by them having joy, right? By them having fellowship or whatever. Oh, Sarah, I plan to do that. So I was going to say, hang on a second, Sarah. I'm going to come back. Let me finish this and then I'll come back to that. Okay. So the our joy. I think that the inclusiveness of the our in that sentence is essential to the meaning, not only of that verse, but of this entire paragraph. Again, I feel like that's what it's building up to. Our joy may be made complete. This is what we do, right? What now is our joy may be made complete, right? Our joy may be made complete because we have fellowship with one another, and our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. This is what then sends me spinning back to verse 1, right? And to asking myself, who's the we from the beginning? We ask this at the very beginning, at the very start, right? Why is he saying we from the beginning? Is it just a convention like the royal we, a convention of the kind, of the sort of convention that the royal we is, where one really means a singular person, but for reasons of formality or convention is speaking of that one person as a plural person, right? And we were saying, no, there doesn't seem to be that kind of a convention. We wouldn't see clear evidence of that kind of a convention, a royal we-esque convention. It's possible that he is speaking on behalf of the other apostles, in spirit, as I believe most of them to be dead by the time this is written. It's possible that he is doing that. Tim, I wonder if the we includes writer apostles and the Father and Son. Golly. Suppose I can't rule it out, based on this paragraph. But it doesn't make much sense. Especially in verse 1. What we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at, it's all from the point of view of those who have received proof of the truth of things, right? Yeah. Anyway. But here's the other thing. And this, Sarah, I'm coming back to the point that you were just making. Sarah's pointing out that he uses, I mentioned before that I write, write is going to be a popular verb in this epistle. He's usually going to do it in the singular. He doesn't, the other reason not to see this as a mere kind of convention in which he means I, but he's saying we, conventionally. Like, a newspaper editor might, or like a queen might, right? My primary reason to disbelieve that it is that sort of convention is that he's going to switch to I when he talks about writing. I write. Grapho. He's going to speak in the first person singular lots of times. In fact, the majority of these times, I think we write is unusual, in fact. So the beginning of verse 4 here, these things we write, that's weird. There's a weirdness there. It is not how he's going to talk about it through most of the epistle. Yeah, Alex points out if you include 2nd and 3rd John, the I write is even more of a pattern. Yeah, exactly. Normally, he is going to use first person singular when he's talking about writing, as makes sense, as there really is only one person holding the stylus or the pen, right? It's weird that he says we write. It's unusual. It's a variation from his own pattern. Now, it's hard because we haven't seen that pattern established yet, but we'll see it. And we can talk about it a little bit more as we see that. His own persona, as I say, his persona and his relationship with his readers, something he's going to emphasize quite a bit. But he will speak in the singular a lot over the course of the epistle. He's going to speak in the singular a lot in the course of the epistle. Why is he speaking in the plural here? Not just in verse 4, where he's writing in the plural, we are writing, but also in the first verse. Who's the we, right? And increasingly, I have a hard time believing that he's writing from the collective perspective of speaking on behalf of the other apostles. I don't think that's logically unlikely at all. But I do find it not to fit with how he talks through most of the rest of the epistle. And so, as we're thinking about this message, right, what he's saying in these first two sentences, the second of which is much shorter than the first, right? What he's saying in these two sentences is, I think he's playing with the pronouns on purpose. I think that the question we were asking from our first discussion, from session 2, right? Who's we? We have heard, we have seen, we have looked at, we have touched with our hands. Who's we? Who's we? I think we're supposed to be asking that, right? I think that he's, we have seen it. We proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. I think that his pronouns, we've got the we and we've got the us, and it just becomes the our. And then in my ear, it's hard not to hear, like there's a way, and there's a sense in which the we, I think, is inclusive all the way through. We have heard, we have, that he's like enacting the proclamation grammatically through the first paragraph. And I think we can see how that inclusiveness starts to creep back in, right? Okay, so I'm, a first century Christian in Ephesus, right? I didn't, in fact, handle Jesus with my hands. I did not touch the risen Lord. But isn't there a sense in which I can say, in which John can say, we have heard, we have seen with our eyes, we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life? Is there a sense in which that's true? Yeah, there is. If we are in fellowship together, right? If I touch something with my hands or see something with my eyes, my kidneys don't touch it themselves, right? But we, the body, that complex we, which is one thing and yet many together, right? The body, the fellowship of believers joined in fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. We have heard and seen and looked at and touched with our hands the word of life. I wasn't there, right? But I am joined with those who have. This is a mystery, right? As Paul might say. But that kind of, it's that overlay of mystery that I start to hear when I come back to the, at first it just sounds like either he must be either using a convention or speaking on behalf of the apostles. Like, or, like he's representing hey, shout out from all of us over here. It sounds like that at first, right? But then by the time I get to verse 4 and circle back, I'm like, actually, I think maybe not. I think I'm hearing more than that. Which means, of course, that we're even involved by implication in the proclamation to us, right? It's all connected. Even the obviously exclusive we's, right? We proclaim to you so that you may have fellowship with us, right? Those are the two obvious, like there's we over here and there's you over there, right? And yet we are even, in a sense, I think, involved with that. Because, of course, his proclamation is our proclamation as well, right? I mean, like, that is, the life was manifested, and we have seen and testify and proclaim to you the eternal life, right? That's not just their job, right? That's our job too. We have seen and bear witness and proclaim the eternal life. This is what happens when the life, the Zoe, is revealed, right? Now, keep in mind, I'm not turning away from what we were talking about the difference between the word of life and the word of life stuff in verse 1, right? There's also that other sense in which that other kind of justification for the inclusive we, right? We have heard, we have seen, we have looked at and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life stuff, right? That which came next, right? The eternal life, the life that was manifested, that they have all seen. The life, the Zoe, the eternal Zoe, right? Which is of the word, right? Which is the consequence, right, of which is the gift, as we will be told later on. They've all heard, seen, looked at, and handled that as well, right? So here, using his own eyewitness credentials, his own in-person, first-hand relationship with Jesus as a model, as a parallel to their own in-person, first-person interactions with the Word of Life stuff, right? Okay. So I'm not going to move on to verse 5 because we're almost done. But I do want to kind of challenge myself here. And what I want to challenge myself with is, this is the part of things where I am least practiced. I'm, a literature teacher by trade, right? That's what I do by training and by trade. It's what I do. I'm a professor. What I don't do a lot of, frankly, in my normal teaching is personal application, right? And I want to challenge myself here. It's easy for me to get into a zone, right, where we're doing literary analysis, right? We're looking at, and we're digging deep, and we're tying things together, and we're seeing patterns and drawing conclusions, and it's fantastic. But of course, as I say, I'm not used to then turning and saying, so what does this mean for us? What does this mean for me? Right. Not to say that I never do that myself, but I certainly never do it in my teaching, and I don't want to lose sight of that. I think it's really important here, right? So let's go back and kind of connect these concepts together. The Word of Life stuff, as I said, Jesus came, the Word became flesh, life was manifested. Now what? What does this mean for us, for you and me? Eternal life has been revealed to us, and I certainly don't think he's talking about the future when we die. I talked about, like, there's that time before conversion, right? There's that time before, we are joined in fellowship with God and in fellowship with each other. And then there's the time of perfection later on. When he's talking about eternal life, I do not at all believe he is talking about that time of perfection. I think he is talking about what happens in between, right? We have fellowship with the Father and with his Son, King Jesus. And we have fellowship with each other. And not just joy, but we can have fullness of joy. And that fullness of joy seems to be connected with the fellowship with each other and with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. And notice how all of that is grounded in this clear evidence, that pattern that he keeps doing. We have heard, seen, looked at, touched. We have seen, testify, and proclaim, right? There's all this forensic language, especially testify and touched with our hands, right? Handled. We have reason, right? We have evidence for these things. It's grounded. All this stuff is grounded in personal experience. My application, my challenge, I guess, that I would say here is, do we believe that we can live in fullness of joy? Are we ready for that? Do we believe that we can have that our joy can be made complete here and now? Not someday, not when we die. Now. That we could walk out into present tense fullness of joy. May be made complete. It's present tense. It's subjunctive mood, right? It's conditional, like we write these things so that this might happen, right? That's the subjunctive mood. But it's present tense, right? It's present tense. Our joy may be made complete. Are we ready for our joy to be made complete? Are we willing to be in fellowship with one another? To really accept that that's an inescapable part of our fellowship with God, and that it correlates with fullness of joy? Yeah, Sarah says the whole epistle should be subtitled how to be confident in Christ. Yes, confidence. Oh man, that's going to be such an important concept later on in this epistle. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That's there are a lot of inhibitions that we have against this. And I think, and I believe that John has started to tell us and is going to tell us more, that we have too many inhibitions, that we're good at saying, I'm only a work in progress. And of course, that's perfectly true. But Jesus is not a work in progress, nor are his promises only something that will someday come true. If we believe what we believe, are we willing to walk what we believe? Now, it's funny, in my tradition, where I've come from, whenever I start talking like that, willing to walk what you believe, I immediately, in my tradition, I'm immediately starting to think about when you're facing opposition, are you willing to put Jesus first above other things? And that's obviously involved, right? But sometimes I think that the modern church seems to me to be actually better. Okay. Yeah. Actually, now that I contemplate the sentence I was about to utter, I think it's even more true than I was thinking. I think that it's quite clear, I'll make it stronger, that the modern church is much better at defying the world than it is at living in fellowship. Defiance of the world, standing up for the truth, right? Believing in the promises. That's good. But what are the promises? The promise here is that our joy may be made complete, right? Where John says our joy will be made complete if we're in fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, and with each other. Do we step into that? Do we do that? If we, as a church, prioritized, if we as people, just think yourself in your own life, right? If you prioritized fellowship with others as much as standing up for the truth, what would that look like? What would that look like? I was chiding myself because I started saying, remember, that I was ready to fight with anybody who disagreed with me in verse 4, except that's me falling into the trap. A trap I've fallen into so many times before in my life, right? And that's the kind of irony, right? The kind of irony in this whole thing. To stand for this truth means not fighting other people about this truth. If you fight other people, I mean, imagine fighting with somebody about fellowship, right? Somebody else says that, they have a different understanding of what it means to be in fellowship with one another. And I'm like, no, doggone it. Right? We should be in fellowship with one another. And I'm going to smack you if you disagree. Seriously, how can you even do that? Where can you even go? Yeah, Sarah, I agree. Sarah Jameson says true fellowship comes with a great deal of humility. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, Stephen, exactly. Stephen says, it's not my fault if I don't have fellowship. It's the other believer's fault for not being right as I define it. Yeah. Oh, exactly. It's so easy. It's so easy. Yeah, John says, I've been working in church for 20 plus years, and I can confirm that people will definitely fight about fellowship. Yeah, no, I know it. I see that. Yeah, and hey, you're absolutely right. She's reminded of the double commandment of love. Love God and your neighbor. Both are needed. They can't be separated. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. All of the law and the prophets are in those two statements together, right? And anyway, but even joy, I'll stop in a minute, but even the joy part, when I talk about things that are hard, like promises that are hard for us to step into, leaps of faith that are challenging for us to make, or ways in which we often focus more on what I believe most of us at the time genuinely believe to be humble, right? Like, okay, I get the work in progress thing, right? Yeah. I'm a work in progress. The process of sanctification is long. I have a long way to go. No doubt you do, right? But what are you saying? What are you believing in yourself? What image of yourself are you invested in, right? Do you believe that your joy may be made complete? That you can have complete joy, full, that your joy can be full up, right? That we can have partial joy, we all know from experience, right? We've all tasted that, I think. I have to imagine. I mean, I don't know, maybe for some of you haven't, but I know I have, right? We've all tasted the joy. Those of us who are Christians have all tasted the joy that comes with belief, right? That comes with that relationship. But incomplete joy, right? But how long after you came to be a believer did you start thinking, well, is this it? Right? Yeah. 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 We're going to come back, Tim, to koinonia, the word that is being translated fellowship here. We've been talking about communion as well. Tim, I'm not going to be talking about Paul's usage of the term. I'm going to try to be as strict as I can about building a Johannine vocabulary, trying to understand how he's using these terms within this context. And we'll see. He's going to come back to it soon. Not often, but soon. We'll get it in the next few verses. So we'll see. Yeah. Hey is saying that Saint Francis had it said that he had joy as the main virtue of his order of friars. Yeah. If his friars were not joyful, he sent them to pray because they could not. How could they not be joyful if their relationship with God was as it should? Yeah, I agree. At joy, completeness of joy, it is essential. It should be. It is attainable. It is attainable, and it's not just about feelings. You know what I mean? Well, it's just hard. That would need a deeper study of the word chara, the word joy, which we're not going to have time for, mostly because John doesn't use it much. It's not a major word in his epistle here, so we're not going to be spending a lot of time with the concept of joy, because he doesn't develop it much in this epistle here. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, all right. So, and remember, John hasn't even started getting up in our business yet, right? Like this is nothing. This is nothing compared to how much John's going to get up in our business. And so I'm trying at the beginning to challenge myself, and at the very least, at the end of every paragraph, when he's starting to transition into a new thought, I want to make sure that we're stopping and thinking about application. What does this mean? What does this mean for us? And I encourage you, go to the Slack channel, and share what is it that you find challenging here? What in your life do you think is most what does this kind of resonate with? I'd really like to talk about that more. So yeah, as I say, I'm trying to discipline myself to make sure that I stop and do the application thing, because it's not normally part of my teaching pattern. All right, I've kept you guys late today. I apologize for that. I am going to be away for the next 3 weeks, so we won't have our next session will actually be on April 10th, Sunday, April 10th. I'll be here then, and I look forward to connecting with you guys again then. Probably not the next week, as that's Easter over here. So if I'm remembering correctly, my calendar. So I'll probably be doing family stuff that day. But anyway, I'll be back on the 10th. And I'll be traveling until then. Thanks, everybody. Stay in touch on our Slack discussion. Send me an email. Use the contact form on the webpage if you want to be invited still. If you're not into the Slack and you want to be on an invitation, send me a message through the contact form, and I'd be happy to bring you in. All right. Thanks very much, everybody, and I'll see you guys in a few weeks. Bye now.